Mrs. Reichelt, and we're moving into this is the second part of the GI tract. So last video we talked about all of the different organs of the GI tract, except for we didn't make it quite to the stomach, so we're just picking up off at the stomach. So the stomach is located on the left side of the abdominal cavity. This is basically where food enters. So this is the lowest part of the esophagus. So food enters at the esophageal sphincter, which is right in here. That's how food gets in. The fundus is that top portion of the stomach there. And then food is going to empty into the small intestine and the pyloric sphincter valve, which basically, once food is in there, then all of a sudden it's going to be able to be emulsified and broken down right in here. So the major regions of the stomach are the cardiac region, which is near the heart. Then you have the fundus, which is the expanded portion that's lateral to the cardiac region. And then you have the body, which is the mid portion, and you can see that kind of right in here, that mid portion. Then you have the pylorus, which is funnel shaped, and it's also the terminal end. So the pylorus is kind of right in here. So the major functions of the stomach is that it's a temporary food storage tank. So basically food is just going to come in here, food stuff is going to come in here, and it's going to start to be broken down. So it's also the site of food breakdown. Chemical breakdown of protein begins in here. So any kind of protein that you're going to eat, chemicals are going to start being broken down in here. It also delivers chyme or processed food to the small intestine. So after your food is broken down into smaller pieces, the name food doesn't really apply anymore. Now it's chyme. And if you look right in here where the pylorus is, it's going to head into the duodenum or the duodenum, and we now are going to call that foodstuff chyme. Then we get into the small intestine. The whole purpose of the small intestine is to absorb all of your food. So the small intestine is arguably the most important digestive system organ probably. So it's the body's major digestive organ, and it's responsible for the absorption of nutrients into the blood. So if you look right here, you should be able to see part of the lumen. So remember, the lumen is the hole where that chyme and food stuff is. So if we were to unwrap that lumen, you can see, if we were to magnify it really, really small, you can see all of these little structural adaptations. We call these villi and microvilli. And we have some circular folding, and all of these little structures are supposed to increase the surface area for absorption of nutrients. So the small intestine is just a muscular tube that extends from the pyloric sphincter, which is that base part of your stomach, and then it goes into the ileocecal valve. And it is suspended from the posterior abdominal wall by the mesentery tissue. And here are a couple of the subdivisions of the small intestine. You have the duodenum or the duodenum, which is attached to the stomach. It curves around the head of the pancreas. Then you have the jejunum, which attaches anteriorly to the duodenum. And then the ileum is the last one and extends from the jejunum to the large intestine. I would say probably the duodenum is one of the most important ones, because that's where a lot of that initial breakdown or food absorption is going to be. So some chemical digestion in the small intestine. Basically, you have chemical digestion is still occurring. It's not that it all happens in the stomach, as I kind of told you in the stomach slides, but really digestion is still going to occur, and food breakdown will still happen in the small intestine as well. So you have some enzymes that are produced by intestinal cells, as well as the pancreas. So the pancreas is going to secrete some of its hormones and enzymes directly into the small intestine. So the pancreatic ducts are going to carry enzymes to the small intestine, as well as you're going to have bile. Bile is formed by the liver, and it enters through the bile duct. Bile is just to emulsify fat. Bile helps to break down fat. All right, so we're still in the small intestine here, and here's where we were kind of talking about the small intestine has a structure that it enables it to absorb a lot of nutrients. So we have three So you're going to have three structural adaptations. They are the microvilli, the villi, and circular folds. The microvilli are tiny projections out of the plasma membrane that create a brush border kind of appearance. So if you look at this diagram here in the lower left, you should see that there's those little finger-like structures that look kind of like that. Basically, that's a way to increase the surface area for absorption, so those food molecules can go into the cells. Then you have villi. Villi are finger-like structures that are formed by the mucosa. So this is an example of a villi. Okay, so right there's a villi. They're similar to the microvilli. And then the last one are these circular folds. So if you look at this larger diagram, you should be able to see that there are these foldings inside of that lumen, which allow for more cells to be in appearance, basically. So it allows for more surface area, which increases the amount of nutrients that can be absorbed. Then we get, after the small intestine, we get into the large intestine. So the large intestine is larger in diameter, but it's much shorter in length. So the small intestine is really long, but it's also really narrow. And then the large intestine is larger in diameter, but not as big as in length. It also forms the internal abdomen. And then we get to the cecum here. So the cecum is right here. Basically, the small intestine is going to come in right here. And the cecum is right here. It's the sac-like first part of the large intestine. Evolutionarily speaking, scientists think that the cecum was likely a second stomach for the body, but we don't have that anymore. So the cecum is just that sac-like part of the first part of the large intestine. And then you drew over the appendix. So the appendix is this little finger-like structure right here. It's an accumulation of lymphatic tissue that sometimes becomes inflamed. When a person gets appendicitis, typically you have a lot of lymphoid tissue that gets caught in here, and it gets larger and larger and larger, and then ultimately it can rupture at some point too. And the appendix hangs from that cecum. All right, so then we get into the colon, and basically the colon is made up of an ascending colon, which means that it's going upwards. It's made up of the transverse colon, which after it goes ascending, and then it goes transversely. Okay, and then lastly, it's the descending colon, and then the last little part is the sigmoid colon, which is right here. Okay, the sigmoid colon is going to enter the pelvis. And then lastly, you have the rectum and the anal canal, which is also located in the pelvis. The anus is the opening of the large intestine right here. Okay, the external anal sphincter is formed by skeletal muscle, and it's under voluntary control. That's a big deal. So most of your intestine is involuntary. You don't have to worry about moving food from your ascending colon to your transverse colon, but this sphincter is under voluntary control. Your internal ones are involuntary, just as we talked about. They're formed by smooth muscle, and then these sphincters are normally closed except for during defecation. And then a couple little add-ons with the large intestine. They have no villi. Remember, the villi helps to increase surface area for absorption, but the large intestine is really going to deal with the absorption of water. It reabsorbs water there. Then you have goblet cells that produce an alkaline mucus that lubricates the passage of feces. And then you have a muscularis externa layer, which is reduced to 3 bands of muscle. So that's kind of interesting. And then the bands are going to cause the wall to pucker as well, which will help fecal matter move through the large intestine. And that wraps up the anatomy of the GI tract. I hope you found it helpful.